For almost 100 years, he made people throughout America laugh. But he died in an empty mansion next to a strange safe that no one had ever opened. No one else had ever opened it. People called Bob Hope the king of the 20th century, a sign of patriotism, happiness, and fun. But behind that smile was a life that no one really got, where fame, power, and being alone mixed together like a cruel joke of fate. Hope went from being an impoverished immigrant youngster in London to being a legend of TV, radio, and movies. A man who dealt with presidents and made warriors laugh during the battle and make a lot of money. But the more he rose, the empire of laughing he had built took over more and more of his life. Affairs, hidden relationships, and adversaries in the entertainment world slowly closed in on a man who used to seem like he could do anything. After a long wait, the safe was finally opened. There was no money inside when he died, just the secrets of 100 years. And that's when the real story of Bob Hope began. And to grasp why a man may make, we have to make the whole world laugh while living with a sadness that no one can touch. Go back to the beginning. A wet, tiny spot on the edge of London at the beginning of the 20th century, when a kid named Leslie Towns Hope was born. The date is May 29, 1903. The Hope family was big yet poor. 7 boys lived in a little rented cottage with their father, who was a stonemason, and their mother, who had been an amateur opera singer singing in modest venues to make a little more money. Their lives the stench of dust, the groan of cutting machines, and a faint singing voice that was hard to hear over everything else made up their world. The sounds of a working-class area. When Leslie was only 4 years old, his parents did the best they could. The most desperate bet of their life. They went to America. They got there in 1908. In Cleveland, Ohio, a city that is cold and full of smoke, but also full of optimism. For them, it was not only the country of dreams, but also the only place they could live. Bob's childhood was not at all glamorous. He sold newspapers and polished shoes, carried bricks and moved tables with weights, anything that could make a little money. But in the middle of all that trouble, the slender boy learned one thing. People could forget they were hungry if they laughed. Leslie stepped on stage at 10 for the first time in a contest to look like Charlie Chaplin. He copied every step and every tilt of the cap. And when he knew he had found a way out of the oppressive silence of poverty when the crowd cheered. But life wasn't finished testing him. He almost died in a job accident. While lending a hand, Leslie tripped and fell from the top of a power pole, breaking his face and falling. Not aware. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks. The nurses wouldn't allow him look in a mirror. When he finally did, his features looked different, sharper and harsher, and somehow more rebellious, as if fate had given him a new look. After that, in the fall, Bob Hope was no longer the dreaming boy. He dropped out of school and took any work he could find, and eventually started fighting under the name Patchy East. And he won 3 of the 4 bouts and lost 1. But that loss was the start of everything. Hope chuckled and said the punch had knocked him out in the ring. Took him right to dance school. And indeed, it did. He started to learn how to dance, putting up shows in little theaters all throughout Ohio. No one understood that beneath the clumsy steps of an immigrant boy, a fresher rhythm was starting to take shape, one that would last him for 100 years. After that close call, after his catastrophic fall, Bob Hope started a new adventure, one where he had to be physically strong, and the sound of laughter and the beat of the music came together. He learned tap dance in the early 1920s, dance in cheap courses in Cleveland, where the hardwood floors groaned and the audience was typically only a few inebriated people, guys. He cleaned the floors of theaters during the day. He prepared routines for local vaudeville groups at night. Vaudeville is a disappearing art form that still gave anybody who wanted to be on stage a route in. In the middle of the loud shows, Hope learned that spectators didn't only want to see who could dance faster. They wanted to forget about real life, even if it was only for a little while. In the year 1924, he first used the stage name Lester Hope, but he quickly changed it to Bob Hope, short and catchy, and sounding like a promise of hope in a country that is still going through bad times. It was a blur for the next 3 years, traveling all the time. From 1925 to 1927, he traveled all throughout the United States, playing in decrepit theaters, fairs, and train stations. Sometimes he even slept on boxcars. Theaters, fairs, and railroad stations, where they occasionally slept in boxcars. A lot of shows ended in tragedy. drink, tossed things, canceled reservations. He once got fired for not being witty enough. But those failures gave him the sharp wit and timing that would later define him, the ability to read a room and change it in a split second. By 1928, Bob eventually got his big break when he met George Burns and Gracie Allen, the famous comedy team. They saw in the young man had a rare energy that was sharp, fast, and inherently interesting. Their suggestions, he stopped dancing, picked up a microphone, and that changed his life forever. From that point on, Bob Hope started doing stand-up comedy, which was new at the time and required one the performer had to hold the whole stage with only speed and humor. He had by 1930 got to New York, the heart of all artistic dreams. Hope became a member of the Ziegfeld Follies, was one of the most famous variety shows in the US. It helped many theater stars get their start. Even though he was just a supporting act, yet his unique approach rapidly caught people's attention. Unscripted, with rapid one-liners that broke up the rigid, formal tone of the show. Behind the curtain, the Follies were a place of war, artists fighting for seconds of fame, applause, and staying alive. Hope, on the other hand, took a different route. He watched and learned how spectators reacted, responded, and then silently used it all as material for himself. He made it in 1932, his first time on local radio, which was a modest test broadcast that no one didn't know it would be the start of a new age. His speech was rapid and his words were cutting. Bob Hope stood out from hundreds of other entertainers because of his funny jokes and insightful satire. He was no longer the lowly vaudeville dancer. He had turned into a storyteller with rhythm, juggling words like lightning, quickness, and cleverness. Those first broadcasts were the start of the machine gun, the type of comedy that would make him famous, as well as the fire that made sure he would never really be able to rest again. It was during those hard years between Bob Hope carved his own way in little theater venues and the early days of radio, not by attempting to be serious storyteller, but by making art out of being spontaneous. He did his first in 1933. In the musical Roberta, he made his Broadway debut as Huckleberry Haynes, a smart, quick-witted musician who knew when to tell a joke. The play was a big smash, and the name Bob Hope became recognized to people in New York as something new, up to date, and full of life. The clapping on that platform didn't just change his, it confirmed something bigger than his profession. Hope was born to lead a room, not to give up its prominence. Hollywood called in 1934 and asked him to star in his Going Spanish was his first movie. But instead of unlocking the door to the movies, it was a horrible fall. The film was not well received by critics. People left the theater early, and Hope went through the kind of a lot of actors never get over the embarrassment. But such failure showed the truth. He wasn't meant to read someone else's lines. He was supposed to compose his own beat. Bob Hope went back to the stage after that and worked on his unique monologue approach, speaking directly to the audience without a script or any preparation, guided only by instinct and words. One night, tired with explaining the next day's itinerary, he started making up jokes on the spot. The place. People in the crowd burst out laughing. Hope understood at that instant. The actual art wasn't in the sketches. It was about making people forget about time. He formally joined NBC Radio in 1935 and started his own show, The Bob the Hope Show. Millions of Americans were tuning in every week within a few months. Hope wasn't just making jokes. He was giving America a new beat during the Great Depression, sharp, quick, and full of the funny side of the working class. In 1938, 3 years later, he got to anew The Pepsodent Show, the most popular radio show in the country, had more than 30 million listeners at its peak. Once a week, Hope paid for authors out of his own pocket to keep up that pace. 8 at first, then 15, and finally more than 100, creating a huge system that the press would subsequently call the Laugh Factory. Every day, the writers had to send in 20 new jokes, all of which were organized by topic and kept in different filing cabinets at Hope's office. The same collection that will one day be put up in his famous safe. Bob Hope became famous on the radio, and then he moved to the big screen, where he found a different kind of light, bright but harsh. He did this in 1939. He had his first significant role in the 1938 Great Broadcast, which was a light-hearted musical that became a major turning point. That movie was where the song Thanks for the Memory was played, a sad but funny ballad sung in Hope's style, half-talking, half-singing manner. The song won the Oscar for Best Original Song. The song, and Bob Hope's name, will always be associated to it. For the next 60 years, he sang it again at the close of almost every show. Always with new words, occasionally sometimes amusing, sometimes poignant, but always full of emotion. It was his method of saying goodbye, not only to the others in the room, but maybe to himself as well. The man who laughed all the time and experiences that stayed with them. After that accomplishment, Hope paired up in 1940, joined Bing Crosby and Dorothy Lamour to develop one of the most popular film franchises in America, the Road to series, starting with Road to Singapore. The series lasted over 20 years and has titles like Road to Zanzibar, Road to Morocco, and Road to Bali, made tens of millions of dollars. A lot of money for its period. Hope, Crosby, and Lamour became a trio, the face of American comedy and adventure. Funny, naughty, and full of charm. But there was a lot of tension underneath the friendship, especially between Hope and Crosby, two big egos fighting for control. They joked around on screen like friends from the past. They often envied each other when they weren't on screen. Their connection was both a wellspring of creative energy and a wound that never entirely healed. Bob Hope's career took a completely different turn when World War II broke out. From 1941 to 1945, he abandoned the movie studios to make people laugh in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, places that are buried in blood and smoke. He stood atop ammo crates in the dirt every night, making jokes and singing to thousands of tired soldiers. He was the embodiment of America on stage. Spirit, strong and unafraid. But when the lights went out, those who were on the road, people who were with him, reported that there were evenings when he sat in silence with tears streaming down his face. Bob Hope had seen the worst of suffering, bodies and shouts from field hospitals. But the next morning he would go out, he smiled again, as if pain didn't bother him. Those years changed him to be the war's entertainer. Later, the U.S. Department of Defense gave him the Legion of Merit for bringing faith in the middle of fear. Bob Hope, after the war ended in 1946, came home as a hero without a uniform and right away became the first comic to host the Academy Awards, which started a tradition that lasted for more than 20 years. A year later, Variety said he was the highest-paid movie star in America, beating out several of the biggest names in Hollywood. But the more famous he grew, the more alone he felt. Big parties, fancy galas with rich people and politicians. All of it just made the emptiness inside me worse. His part in The Paleface by 1950 brought him back to the top once more. He won the Golden Globe for Best Actor for the Western Comedy, which showed that Hope was more than just a sign. He was an artist who could make people feel things via both laughter and pain. But in the middle of all the grandeur, he started to lose the thing that had gotten him there in the first place, the ability to be happy. Hope always bowed when others laughed, but they people who looked attentively remarked his eyes showed a subtle tiredness, as if the man who made it was slowly losing his soul to laughter. Though Bob Hope was one of the most famous people in Hollywood, yet the Academy never thought of him as an artist who takes their work seriously. He never had a single Oscar nomination for his work, even though he worked for a long time. Even though hosting the ceremony a record 19 times, which remains a record. He got 4 honorary Oscars, one of which was the Jean Herschel Humanitarian Award in 1960 for his work for charity. But paradoxically, the man who made everyone laugh never got praise for his art. Hope would bow with a smile as he sat among the sparkling chairs of the Oscars. But he must have known that they were celebrating his image, not the man himself. As Hollywood's golden age began in 1954, Bob Hope once again showed how talented he was by giving way to television. To change. With the Bob Hope Christmas special, he brought his funny side to TV. Special, which established a custom in the United States for the next 40 years. Millions of families would turn on their TVs to hear him every Christmas. Laughs, his greetings, or just to experience the warmth that only Hope can provide. But things weren't always so happy behind the scenes. During 1957, during production, he had a lot of problems with director Norman Panama, whom he said didn't get that comedy deserved to be respected. Hope made Paramount rewrite the whole script, which slowed down the production crew to the point of exhaustion. He was often obsessed with being perfect, because after so he had been under a lot of pressure to make people laugh for many years, so he didn't know how to relax anymore. Bob Hope got 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960, one for cinema and one for television, which shows how well he did in both. But that same prominence took him to a very different battlefield. from 1963 until Hope did a series of USO Christmas trips from 1972 to 1975, traveling into war zones, visited Vietnam to perform for American troops in the middle of the carnage. These trips became emblems of love for one's country, but they also left severe emotional wounds. He looked blood, hurt troops, and youthful faces that would go quiet after a few seconds after they laughed. Several times, hostile fire threatened or almost hit his planes. He lived by inches. As the conflict went on and people's opinions changed, a lot of people started to see him as a way to spread propaganda. Bob Hope was harshly ridiculed. Therefore, he chose not to protect himself, but because he was in pain. He was a cheery storyteller, but within he was tired of the memories he could never erase. Delete. He kept performing even though there was a lot of talk about it. He thought that what he delivered wasn't politics. It was comfort. During this time, President Lyndon B. In 1970, Johnson gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. But as the 1970s went on, the audience changed. They wanted crisper comedy that is more rebellious. Bob's voice is like George Carlin's and Richard Pryor's. Hope's elegant, polished style started to seem old-fashioned. By the year 1976, the ratings for TV shows were going down. People were moving on, and the press branded him a symbol of a time that was over. Then, in 1978, he got the news that really broke him. His mother died. The woman who had taught him to sing and been his spiritual guide since he was a child was Bob Hope fell into a temporary despair when he unexpectedly disappeared. He had been doing this for months, vanished from the public eye. No scripts, no shows, and no microphone. He thought the world was too silent. And for the first time, laughing felt like something far away. Bob Hope didn't come back until 1980, when he released his autobiography, Don't Shoot, It's Only Me, talks about how lonely comedy can be and the emptiness that came after the applause stopped. The novel touched millions of people who read it. They sensed that the man who had brought them so much delight knew better than anyone else. 3 years later, in 1983, he got the Kennedy Center Honors, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award that honors his work in the performing arts in the United States. It was a fitting way to remember a lifetime of service, but also a goodbye to a generation that was disappearing gone. By the middle of the 1980s, Bob Hope started to talk openly about getting older, not with dread, but with acceptance. He still made jokes and was on TV, but his eyes looked different, less loud, more far away. As he became older, he acted as if they were terrified that stopping would make them disappear. Bob Hope was no longer an image of an old artist employing comedy instead of a carefree chuckle to make time less painful. When Bob Hope's career was over, he reached dizzying heights of popularity, and his fame spread to every corner of America. His private life remained a story carefully hidden behind the glittering surface. Life was still a story that was carefully disguised under the shiny veneer, and at the heart of that story was the Dolores Reed, a stunning nightclub singer, was the only woman who ever stayed. A voice as warm as a summer day in New York. In the early 1930s, Bob and Dolores met. Hope was still trying to make it as a vaudeville performer, and Dolores was the main singer for the Ziegfeld Group, the very picture of the glamour of American theater. But not many people knew this before they met in January 1933. Bob secretly married Grace Louise Troxell, a fellow vaudeville performer. In January 1933. Hope was 30 years old, and Grace was a woman in her 20s who works in Chicago. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. However, it was the first wrinkle in his personal life. Hope fell in love with someone else even though he was still married to Grace. Dolores, a woman who entirely captured his heart, made him say in public himself married to her in February 1934, before his first marriage had ended. Legally ended. Hope didn't officially divorce Grace until November of that year, which led to biographers to think he had married 2 women, one before the other ended. Things with something else. It got even more confusing when there was no marriage license or there were never any pictures of Hope and Dolores's reported wedding. And documents show that he was actually playing in New York on the night they said they were having the ceremony. Even so, they stayed together for 69 years, as if time itself had shown that their marriage was real. Hope kept sending money to Grace Troxell, his first wife, for many years until her death, a rare act of kindness in a life full with lies. Bob and Dolores took in 4 kids: Linda 1939, Anthony 1940, who died in 2004, and twin Kelly and Nora, 2 girls, were born in 1946. They made the picture of a perfect Hollywood family by always smiling in pictures of their house lit up for Christmas and their humorous spouse, who is liked by everyone in America. But only those on the inside could see the cracks behind that immaculate front. While Bob traveled the world to perform, Dolores quietly took care of the home, taking care of their kids while her husband became the man of many other women. By the end of the 1940s, when his career was at its peak and his name was everywhere, the cracks behind Bob Hope's smile began to emerge. Hollywood found out that the man who made everyone laugh had a private life full of darkness that few people could picture. The first of numerous controversies he was involved in was Barbara Payton was a fiery young actress who was more noted for being rebellious than for her acting. Payton and they met in 1949 when Hope was already a big figure across the country when he got to Hollywood. He was pulled to her beauty, her bravery, and her carelessness. Hope offered her jobs, money, and even rented her an apartment so they could meet in secret. But Payton wasn't the type to keep quiet. She told everything to him when he left her. Confidential magazine said Bob Hope a controlling, manipulative man who would kill anyone who got in his way. The news generated a stir, but Hope did what he did best. He didn't say anything and let his strong. The scandal was buried by the publicity team. Barbara Payton's life went downhill quickly after that. She became hooked, lost everything, and unfortunately died aged 39. But that scandal didn't teach them anything. It was just the start of a lengthy string of affairs that were balanced between celebrity and scandal, and lying. Bob Hope was often spotted with Marilyn Maxwell in the 1950s, one of the most beautiful actresses and singers in Hollywood. The media could see how open their connection was, started to call her Mrs. Bob Hope. It was ironic that Dolores, his wife, seemed to accept it as something that can't be changed. Hope took Maxwell on his USO trips and gave her supporting parts in his plays and as a couple on stage. Behind the scenes, it was a love story that lasted over 10 years. Maxwell died of heart failure at the age of 50. Hope is said to have paid for the whole funeral, which seemed like a way to make up for what she did and finally admit her role in his life. Bob Hope was in his 50s by the early 1960s and had already started a bizarre connection that lasted almost 30 years with Rosemary Franklin. Won the title of Miss World in 1961. Franklin was more than 30 years younger than him, Jr., and often went on tours with him, where he was known merely as his private PR. She was the only person who could go with Hope on his world tours and in their close group. Everyone got it. She was the only woman in his life. Franklin died of a heroin overdose at 40, and others who knew him say Bob Hope was quiet for days. Maybe this was one of the few times he really felt like he had lost something. Couldn't be hidden by laughter. Hope also had other things going on besides his love life. Kept key partnerships, the most important of which was with Ursula Hauerin, a strong executive in charge of public relations. She was not only his sweetheart, but also his problem solver. She took care of the press and bought off editors and hid news that could hurt them. Hauerin was in charge of Bob Hope's secrets, and her power rendered him almost untouchable in a time before cameras. But that safety comes at a price. A life tied to connections that don't involve love, simply deals and power. But there were times when the mask came off. Bob came back after a charity tour with Doris Day in 1949. Dolores caught Hope at the airport in a scenario that was horribly ironic. Doris had just gotten off the same flight, fatigued but happy. Dolores said nothing. She just came up to him and hugged him in front of everyone. It was a long, hefty hug that was part forgiveness and half warning. Doris Day understood right away and softly left. For Dolores, it wasn't not jealous anymore. It was the final thing they did to show respect. But age didn't stop Bob either. Hope's amorous adventures. In the 1980s, when he was in his 80s, rumors started to spread concerning Sandy Winger is a young screenwriter who works on his production team. She turned into the last woman he had an affair with. After they broke up, Winger sued Hope for breach of lifetime support, which made him settle privately. When it got out, the public was shocked, not because Hope had cheated again, but because he couldn't stop living like a man who was addicted to feeling. People who knew Bob Hope well say he was never really alone, although never really happy. He made thousands of people laugh, but not many who knew what he was trying to get away from. Dolores, the only one who stayed till the end, opted to be quiet. Maybe because she knew that the man who made the world laugh had never really belonged to not even himself. Dolores never acted like a victim. She dwelt silently, always following him like a shadow. In an interview from 1978, when questioned if she thought her spouse was faithful, she simply said, "I don't think he's perfect, just human." A calm answer that meant a lot to him for the rest of his life. Endurance. She realized that Bob Hope was never meant to be owned by one person. He was part of the audience. And the cost of making the world laugh was that no one could ever get him to quit performing, not even love. As the years went by and the stage lights went out, Dolores was the only one who stayed by his side. They lived in their Tuca Lake mansion and got older together. Once full of laughter stopped, and the only sounds were her soft singing and his heavy breathing. Bob Hope, the man who used to make everyone grin, was left with only one group of people. The woman who knew all of his faults and stayed with him nevertheless. And in the quiet of old age, maybe he finally got it. That Dolores was the only real thing in his life. Bob Hope's last years were a quiet coda, a gradual, elegant end of the book about a man whose story had been told in both beautiful and sad ways. After decades of working with, he was no longer merely a Hollywood star. He was an artist and a soldier. He has become part of the memory of all Americans. At the 50th Academy Awards in 1986, Bob Hope was an honored guest at the ceremony. He stood between two longtime friends, Johnny Carson and Frank Sinatra. Johnny Carson and Frank Sinatra were pals. When he got on stage, everyone in the audience stood up and clapped for 10 minutes straight. At that point, no one remembered the scandals or the arguments. Thank you for the man who had made generations laugh during some of the worst times in history. In 1990, 4 years later, the American film The Institute gave Hope the WWII Life Achievement Award, which is a lifetime distinction. Realizing that his legacy was more than just hundreds of performances. It was about how he had come up with the notion of fun for the 20th century. He shook as he accepted the trophy, but his eyes still shone. The eyes of a guy who had never really stopped doing. 3 years later, in 1993, his hometown showed its respects when Queen Elizabeth II made him an honorary Knight Commander of the British Empire. For Bob Hope, who moved to London as a 4-year-old immigrant, it wasn't just a medal. It was a circular that was finished from a destitute youngster to a world-famous person. People last saw him on stage in 1994. Bob Hope salutes the troops in Washington, D.C. It wasn't simply another show. It was a goodbye to the soldiers, the people who had been with him for more than 50 years. His voice was not strong. His eyes were on a big writing in front of him, but when he grinned, the crowd still laughed. The same old charm, but now with a hint of recollection. After that night, Bob Hope simply stopped performing, as if he knew the spotlight had done its job. He was 93 years old in 1996 and almost blind, so he chose to retire totally from the public eye. He became a Catholic that same year, accepting the faith of Dolores, who stayed at his side through thick and thin. He appeared to find another form of brightness as his physical sight faded, born out of faith and the calm he had never felt before. A year later, on his 94th birthday, President Bill Clinton went to see Bob Hope in person. The funny heart of America. That day, the man who used to live in Tuca Lake made everyone in the world laugh just by sitting still and smiling. Not for an audience this time, but for a life that had finally come full circle, from laughing to calm. By the end of the 1990s, Bob Hope's stage lights had gone out altogether. His body started to show signs of the irrepressible spirit that had previously driven him through combat zones and across countries. In 1998, he got the news that he had with minor memory loss. His short-term memory got worse, and at times he didn't remember old pals. The man who had once blasted off thousands of he used to tell jokes every minute, but now he was a peaceful old man sitting by the window of his Tuca Lake home. The same house that used to be full with laughing from friends, co-workers, and fans. Hollywood, which was used to seeing him smart and quick-witted, had to deal with the fading, frail picture of its most dedicated performer. He didn't go out in public very often anymore, particular accolades when he was well enough. In 2000, the US Congress gave him the Bob Hope Patriot Award, which bears his name, is a last recognition of for 60 years, they entertained and lifted the spirits of American soldiers. But that same year, his health started to get worse. He was in the hospital for a gastrointestinal bleeding and a bad case of pneumonia in 2001, the disease that would eventually take his life. He lost strength and then he pulled away from the public nearly completely. In 1998, the Associated Press unwittingly caused a weird event to happen. Put out his obituary too soon. The fake rumors circulated all over the world and friends and co-workers sent their tributes while Bob Hope was still alive. It is said that he laughed when he heard about his own death. It was probably the final time fate a funny joke for a man who has spent his whole life laughing. On the 29th of May, Bob Hope turned 100 years old in 2003, a milestone that very few people ever reach. The whole country celebrated. 35 states recognized Bob Hope Day in honor of performer who had walked across 100 years with the shoes of a traveler and the heart of a soldier. The news labeled him the man who showed America how to grin. Fans lined up, he joked, "I'm so old they've sent flowers, letters, and recorded tributes, even though he was weak." Half truth, half jest was a quip that summed up his existence perfectly. He laughed even as death got closer. Bob Hope passed away just 2 months later, on July 27, 2003, died at his home in Tuca Lake, California, at the age of 100 years and 2 months. Pneumonia, the same ailment that had plagued him in his last years, was the cause. Dolores asked him where he was when asked where he wanted to be buried. Bob said, "Surprise me." That was his last line. Playful, caring, and deeply human. There were no public services for him. No cameras, no parade. Just how he wanted. No problem. I've had 100 years of people already. Bob Hope spent his whole life in the brightest lights. Went without saying a word. Not merely a monument to American comedy, but also an endless puzzle. The man who created the world laugh, but in the end, they chose to leave it in perfect silence. After he died, people suddenly understood why he had been nicknamed the person who made Americans laugh. In his own office in Tuca Lake, right there was a legendary safe next to his desk, which was well guarded. Vault that only he and his closest aide had been able to get into for decades. When it was finally opened, what they found left everyone dumbfounded. There was no inside luck, but all of Bob Hope's intellectual heritage. Thousands of Like a Crazy Person, screenplays, letters, and notes were put together with perfect accuracy. The records of a cultural organization. There were more than 300 comedic subjects typed, labeled, and put in order from airports to zoos. In the folders there were letters written by presidents, warriors, and fans. One file from 1968 was sealed, was labeled very private. No one knows what's within it. Maybe political jokes, scripts that weren't distributed, or maybe private recollections he wanted to keep for himself. What experts found most interesting was how Bob Hope was able to recycle laughing that spans generations. One of his jokes that didn't work in 1966 made 3 of my stocks go down. The finance page was taken out of the Assistants Wanted advertising and brought back in 1987. After the crash on Black Monday, this time it brought the house down. That Hope was a phenomenon because she had an extraordinary sense of timing. His sense of humor never changed. It changed with the times. The whole collection was in 2000. The Library of Congress digitized and showed the collection in an exhibit called Bob Hope and American Variety is a living museum of entertainment from the 20th century. Bob Hope was a smart investor off of the stage. His Tuca Lake home was built. It was about 15,000 square feet in 1939 and included 8 bedrooms, an indoor pool, and a golf course just for them. A self-contained paradise, just his style. Years it later became a symbol of the classic Hollywood ideal and sold for $15 in 2018 million. He owned the Spaceship Mansion in Palm Springs, which was a 23,000 square foot work of art by the Dome of architect John Nair's building, which was finished in 1979, looks like a volcano crater, worth about $13 million and looks out over the Coachella Desert. He also put money into big pieces of land in San Fernando Valley, Linta, and Palm Desert, which shows the money sense of a man who began his career as a street performer in Cleveland. When he died, the estate was thought to be worth between $150 and $200 million. A truly amazing accomplishment for someone who started with just a song and a dream. After Bob died, Dolores Hope lived for 8 more years in their old home, singing hymns that her husband had adored. She died in 2011 at the age of 102, as if they had lived together for a full century of life. When the world remembered Bob Hope, cartoonists all across the place drew same picture. He was walking up to heaven, where Bing Crosby was waiting with a microphone and a smile. No crying, two longtime pals are just performing a show that never really finished. Maybe that's it. The most accurate picture of Bob Hope, a man who spent his whole life making other people laugh. But behind every roar of acclaim came from someone who lived by discipline, being alone, and in a strong sense that laughing, even if it was only for a short time, was the best method to fight back sadness. People didn't clap for Bob Hope at the end of his century. They were quiet. A man who has given everything to the art of happiness. From a poor boy who came to the US as an immigrant to he was a legend who made the world bend down to him. And he never ceased believing that laughter, no matter how short, was always the most pure expression of grace for people. And that is why his name lives on, not just as a Hollywood icon, but also as part of the recollection of America as a whole. If you ever watched his movies as a kid, ever felt your eyes sting as you heard "thanks for the," if you ever thought of him as a memory or laughed on a bad day because of him, please write a message below. His memory. Tell us about the time Bob Hope made you laugh. And in doing so, they help. If you want to keep his legacy alive, do it in the hearts of the people he made happy, not on stage. For just a second.